In today's video, I want to talk about this little idea that I've had running in my head, talking about the limitation of options and limiting your options. And with this being said, I want you to know this is from a first-hand experience that I've had over and over and over and over again. And I just want to talk about how cameras like the X100V, the Leica Q series, and the Leica GR series, with the GR3 and the Leica Q specifically for me as they're cameras that I've owned, used, and put through their paces, how the ability to limit yourself to the option of that one lens that's on that body, knowing there's nothing else coming with you, and understanding its limitations and where it shines and where it usually doesn't, helps you push forward, push through, and actually create not only images that are pleasing to you, but also images that are compelling to others and that bring people into more of your story and more of what you have going for you. And with that being said, I'd like to give you a background of where this idea has actually started. And it actually started in the summertime of 2021 whenever I had the opportunity to hang out with Dennis Davis of Dennis Davis Bucking Bulls, who is a bull man for the PBR. He actually has a PBR team right now, a bull team with Dana White, the CEO of the UFC, and so I'm excited to hang out with them and get more information on them. But I was there with them in association with the PBR and the ABBI and with Kevin Walsh of the Bullmen, and was just documenting everything, talking to him, talking to his bull riders, seeing the way he does things, hearing things that are coming up and about. And whenever I was preparing for this trip and preparing for this job, I had a whole bunch of stuff packed up. I actually had a giant Domke F2 bag. I had a Peak Design bag, 10-liter sling. I had my 5-liter sling packed, and I had a big backpack that was a roll-up zip bag, just filled with stuff. And I was worried about what lenses to bring and everything, and I was kind of freaking out about, well, what's too much and what isn't. So I decided to bring a giant roll-up zip bag, and so I brought a 70-300, a 50-140, 16-55, a 90 f2, a 35 1.4, and an 18-2, as well as with an XT2 and an X Pro 3. And throughout the whole time when I had that gear there, I was worried about, is it going to get stepped on? Is it going to go missing? Am I using the right lenses? Is it going to get shit on it? Because I literally got bullshit literally flung into my mouth at one point. I was so worried about all these external things, and whenever I stopped and I looked back at what I used during that time, I used only the 70-300, the 35 1.4, and the 18 f2. And majority of the time, I literally had the 18 f2 on the X Pro 3 and probably could have documented the whole thing with that. And the reason why I tell that story is because the time leading up to that, I was crippled with not fear, but I was worried that I wasn't going to pick the right lenses, that I was going to miss a shot because I didn't have my 90 f2, because I didn't have my 50-140, because I didn't have my 16-55, because I didn't have my 35 1.4, because I didn't have my 70-300. I was so worried about what I wasn't or was going to miss and what I could potentially miss, I didn't even think about what am I actually going to use? What do I usually use in situations like this? And that high amount of options made me overthink and overguesstimate. And so when I got back to the hotel that night, I was literally thinking, I am dog ass tired. I carried all this stuff, I was freaking out about it, and now I've got dirt on lenses that I have to clean off that I didn't even have to do this for. I didn't even have to bring all this. I didn't even have to have all this gear lugging around. I could have just brought one small bag, the 18 f2, the 35 1.4, and the 70-300, and been cool with it. I could have just brought the 5140 or the 16-55 if I really needed a zoom lens and I wanted that weather sealing. But the fact is, what I stick to is usually what I'm comfortable with. And a lot of your photography, you'd probably notice that what you stick to is usually what you're comfortable with. And it's great to have a lot of options at lenses. I mean, I'm usually a person that has at least 3 lenses with me, usually at very least 2 lenses. And during the middle of the whole shutdown last year, I had the 35 1.4 and the 18 f2, and that's what I did all my work on. Now I've got these Fujikron lenses, I've got an X Pro 2, and I've got an X100V. And the X100V serves a special purpose, with it being the fact that as great as this is right here, and this is great, being able to have interchangeable lens system is fantastic, there are still times where I overthink what to take. And yeah, it's not as drastic with this kit right here, but of course there are many times where I'm overthinking and I end up in a situation where I only need one of these lenses. I end up bringing all 3, and it's extra gear. And that may seem minimal, but when you take back and you look at the situations where I brought 6 different lenses, all heavy lenses, and I didn't even use half of them, or I only used half of them, you see what I'm talking about. And I know I'm not the only person that's done this. There's actually a couple of people out there who I've watched their videos recently, and they're talking about what they can bring to a portrait shoot or what they can bring for street photography. And of course, they're looking at their 75, their 35, their 23, their whatever and what have you it is. And they're wondering, should I bring this? Because, and of course, every time you grab a lens and every time you buy something, there's a specific thing that you think it's ready for, or it's going to be good for. Me, I shoot sports photography. I shot for, of course, the PBR and the ABBI, but also for the ULS, the MLS, and the MILB with the San Antonio missions and the Corpus Christi hooks. And with that, I would always overthink to myself, what should I bring? What should I have with me? What should I go ahead and put in my bag just in case? So I'd bring a 90f2, a 50-140 with the 1.4 time teleconverter, and the 35 1.4 and the 18f2. And then I looked back at every game that I ever photographed from all these different events. It was just a 50-140 with the teleconverter. I never had the teleconverter off of there, and the 18f2. And those are the only two lenses that I actually used, unless I was testing something for Fujifilm. So when looking back at that and seeing how, honestly, every time I shot, even whenever I was going out and shooting street, I made sure to have a camera bag with more than one lens. I felt so naked and didn't want to be left with one lens, because this one's for portraits, this one's for just street, this one's for if I want to get a different perspective, this one's for, you know, if I need this much room and that much room, and this one's for if it rains, etc., etc. That I didn't really appreciate not having these options and seeing what I could do whenever the options weren't there for me, until I purchased the Leica Q. And the Leica Q is really what kind of opened this up to me. Now, I had an X100V before, and I had, you know, an X100T before, but the Leica Q is really what opens it up to me, because that 28mm focal length is a focal length that I love. It's one that I grew up on, it's one that I learned photography on, and it's one that I'll always have a special place in my heart. And I eventually one day may grab a WCL adapter for this X100V just because of it. But the Leica Q really showed me that regardless of the limitations that a focal length may have, that doesn't mean you're limited as a photographer. And through my time using that lens, even though I didn't like the processing on it, even though I didn't like you know, what was going on inside of the camera, because the images maybe didn't come out too great, especially in anything but perfect lighting, the 28mm was my favorite lens, not because it went down to 1.7, but because, you know, anytime that I used it, and anytime I had that camera in my hand with Leica Q, that was whenever I first started experimenting with using a lens that people see as a wide angle for stuff other than wide angles. So I would take it to events with me. I would take it with me and my fiance were walking around. I would take it to go see family and go see friends and things like that. Whenever I'm hanging out, I would take it to take portraits of people whenever we're hanging out and we're outside. I would use it for low light. I'd use it for supreme light. I use it for, you know, doing landscapes and portraits, etc. All these different things. And the same thing, after that, I purchased a Ricoh GRiii. And the same thing, I used it for landscapes, I used it for portraits, I used it for group shots, I used it for documenting, something that I usually have a 50mm and 28mm to interchange. And I never used the whole digital crop methods, I never used the whole digital zoom ins, the punching in, that whole deal. What I always did was I always made sure on those cameras there was two things. First off, that I always had it in a snap or zone focus situation to where I could just pull up and shoot. Same thing I do with this. I'm shooting this X100V, it's almost always in manual. I hardly use the autofocus. I just have it at f8 since it's 35mm, and basically everything from 2 meters in front of me to infinity is going to be in focus. And the other thing was, I always just remembered, this is the only focal length that I have. So if I'm going to make something happen, I got to make it happen myself. And with that, whether it's portraits, whether it's, you know, doing super duper wide stuff, which a lot of people say a 35 and a 28 aren't good enough for, whether it's detail shots, whatever, being stuck with this lens and being stuck with a single lens while you're out for a day, like with those cameras, it is something that challenges you. Because there's always a situation where you want more. There's always a situation where you want to be able to punch in. There's even situations where you wish you had more megapixels for cropping power. But whenever you stop yourself and you take a full day to go do something like with this, and it doesn't even have to be this. It could just be as simple as from now on limiting yourself and telling yourself, okay, when I go out for the day, I'm only going to have this 35 millimeter on here. That's all I'm going to have. This is it. When I go out for the day, this is the only lens that I'm going to have on my body. It's something as simple as deciding to do that. Deciding to take, not a stand, but deciding to limit yourself with your options that forces you to change the way you're shooting. But you have to tell yourself you're not going to be limited. There are a lot of people that'll tell you anything from 24 millimeter to 35 millimeter is the best for street photography. And a lot of people will tell you that anything tighter than that actually isn't beneficial. But those are people that limit themselves to the ideas and the characteristics of a lens that have been told by people for generations. Again, Henri Bresson, who I don't agree with and isn't my favorite person in the world, made his calling with a 50 millimeter lens. But there are a lot of people that will tell you a 50 millimeter lens on a body is too wide and isn't the perfect street photography lens. In the same way, people will tell you up and down forever and ever that 50 millimeters is as wide as you can get for portraits, and that everything above that is better for portraits, and everything below that, like 35 millimeters here, or if I was to put a WCL or get an 18f2 28 millimeter, isn't right. It's not viable. It doesn't give you the look you need. It's not professional. It doesn't give you the bokeh. It doesn't give you the compression. It has too much of a warp on people's faces. There's too many things going up against it until you try it, until you do it, until you make it work for you, until you decide to not listen to what someone else's idea of what a lens should or shouldn't do. You see, the limitations and limiting yourself from the idea of all these options doesn't hurt you and hold you back. It helps you grow. Because the moment you start putting the work in and you start doing these wide angle portraits, these wide angle, these wide angle environmental portraits, whatever, is a moment that you can actually really make yourself grow as a photographer, because you have to have the same mind and the same way to set up, layer, and to create these portraits with a wider angle, but still understand the limitations and the things that are going to happen with this lens the closer you get to a subject. In the same vein from that, when it comes to people talking about you can only do this, that, and the other with this body, with this lens, it's the same ideas like that get people into ideas like you can't be professional with 2 SD card slots, which of course was a marketing ploy by a lot of large manufacturers, because whenever people saw 2 card slots and on the internet said, hey, this is better for backup so I never lose, anything on my SD cards, it made everyone forget how film photographers weren't shooting on 2 different rolls of film at one time and had a redundancy. And it also made everyone forget how whenever professionals were shooting on earlier DSLRs and things like that only had 1 SD card, people weren't raising their arms in a mass hysteria saying, hey, I'm losing images 1 out of every 10 photo shoots because these cards aren't saving. But in the same vein, you'll have people tell you that. They'll have you tell you that APS-C isn't good enough for photography. They'll also tell you that medium format doesn't matter because it's a larger sensor, but it doesn't mean anything because it's not full frame. Then they'll go and tell you that certain focal lengths you can't do this, that, and the other then, no matter what. But if you look at some of the greatest photographers in the world, like Photo Dre, Andre Wagner, or you look at Stock Easy, Jason Roman, or you look at Sergio, as Sir, or you look at Edward Gilbert, you look at Dorian Coleman, or you look at Steve McCurry, or you look at, even if it's Annie Leibovitz, no matter, all these people, they've all shot at one point on a medium that did not allow them to do a couple things. Number one, they've all shot wide angle portraits. They've all shot street with tight focal lengths, with wide focal lengths. They've gone against the grain and they've broken all the rules. And another thing that they've always done is every single one of them has shot something, some way, somehow on a camera, either with 1 roll of film in it. You can't do multiple rolls of film and get an image. There's no film back for an RB67 that lets you take a photo on 2 separate rolls of film that I am aware of. And the other thing is they've shot on cameras that most likely have 1 SD card slot or internal storage. And they've trusted it and they've made it work. And their work has changed the way a lot of people shoot and inspired so many others just like myself to do the exact same thing. You always have the ability, you always have the choice to believe what someone else said and take that as gospel, or try it out for yourself. And a lot of times it's not about trying it and the error, it's about the trial and error and the trial and the error and the trial and the error and the trial until a success. You see, when we sit here and we say that, you know, this is professional and this isn't professional, to have a fixed lens system with only one SD card slot, it won't work. In the same vein said, okay, you need this, you need an interchangeable lens system to be professional. That limits us. That's what truly limits us. The necessity for options in a lot of ways is what limits us, because we see it as, unless we have the options, we can't do great things. When in fact, no matter what you are, no matter who you are, no matter how many options you have, in the end it comes down to one thing: you being the person capturing light in this device. There's nothing different, nothing changes. The name, brand on top of the camera, the focal lengths, the color science, etc., all this may change, and everything else that marketing departments want you to believe. But that at the end of the day, the most amazing thing whenever it comes to photography is that all that it takes for someone to capture something great and to be great is just to be there. So regardless of what you think, and regardless of what your idea is, especially on something as non-professional as this camera, I mean, it's APS-C, only has one SD card slot, and it's a fixed focal length, or how you feel about the Leica Q. I know a lot of people who said I would never use a Leica Q or a Leica Q2 because it doesn't have two SD card slots, when hands down, greatest lens I've ever used is that 28mm 1.7 Summel. Very biased towards 28. And you know, I've seen a lot of negativity about the X Pro line because it doesn't have a tiltable screen on one line with the X Pro 2 and a flip and a screen that's actually facing the back because the screen's covered in the X Pro 3. I've seen a lot of negativity and a lot of whining about that. That's also not professional. But again, it goes down to that. When you see people downing something, downing another person, they're critical of a certain camera or a certain usage or a certain focal length or a certain lens or a certain aperture, etc., it always goes down to the same thing. They're critical because it doesn't have as many options. And to them, not having those options is a limitation. But to you, just realize and understand, there's no such thing as a limitation until you choose to give up. So with that being said, just don't give up. Let these limitations help you break the limits that you've previously put on yourself when it comes to creative ability. With that being said, hope you guys enjoyed it. Have a good one.